Hey everyone, it's Lena Banks, Certified Financial Planning Professional and Small Business Coach based here in Austin, Texas. Welcome back to your Financial Therapy for the Week. Thanks as always for tuning in. Before we get started today, I need to ask you if you've been enjoying the show, please like, subscribe, give us a review wherever you're listening or watching. I really appreciate that. So today's episode is all about accepting financial loss. I think this is a really tough one for a lot of us, and it leads to a lot of drama in life if you can't really look beyond recent failures and into the future and see them for what they are. And so one of the things that I really like to coach about is, okay, what can we take from what we learned and how do we move that forward? Because that's really the best way to get over a financial loss. So if you haven't yet, go back to listen to the episodes on biases and the 4 horsemen of personal finance, because I've done a couple of episodes on these types of biases and also some deep dives that can be useful in understanding more about what we're talking about today. And today's episode, Accepting Financial Loss, really focuses on 2 of the 4 horsemen, so to speak. So fear and denial, which actually go together, and guilt and shame, which also often go together. Those 2 biases, those 2 of the 4 horsemen contain a lot of biases that we really utilize to kind of object to financial loss and not move it forward. And that can be really dangerous in keeping our minds right when it comes to our money. So when we fail to accept financial loss, these 2 categories of horsemen and some of their related biases can really do a number on us. They don't allow us to move on in a financially healthy way. And I want to talk about 4 of those biases today and about how to have more of a growth mindset in your personal finance when it comes to accepting loss. So by noticing the good things that can happen when we actually go through that process of almost grieving what we've lost. So first, let's talk a little bit about these biases that I'm referencing here. So the first one is loss aversion. This kind of falls into the guilt and shame category because it occurs when people try to avoid losses, even if the investment you've made is really acceptable from a rational investor standpoint, and losing said investment is rational. So let's say that you've invested in some sort of stock, or you've bought something that instantly depreciates, or you, for instance, are underwater on your home, but you've got to sell immediately. That aversion to actually having to push through and do that in order to get yourself out of a financially terrible predicament, that aversion to loss can really stymie us in our financial life for the future. And, in investing, loss aversion can lead to the so-called disposition effect. So that's when investors sell their winning stocks and hang on to their losers to avoid having to log those losses. So it's like I was saying, if you are in a position where you're holding on so that you don't have to actually recognize those losses, sometimes that can be a good strategic move, but sometimes it's really just that loss aversion bias playing games with our mind. So, a lot of people have heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. FOTO, fear of threatening options, is if I know I'm going to lose, I start that spiral of guilt and shame about the loss and how it threatens my current financial existence or my current financial standing or my future financial standing. And I can't get myself past that decision point where I accept the loss and I move myself on. So the second bias that I want to talk about is similar but a bit different, and it's called regret aversion. And this falls more into the fear and denial bucket versus guilt and shame. So instead of looking at a loss and saying, I feel guilty about the idea that that loss is on the table and that I'm going to have to realize it, regret aversion is a behavioral bias that stems from the fear of omission or commission of said financial sin. So it causes people to avoid making decisions because they fear the possibility of regretting them or of losing out or of somehow making a mistake. And so it's driven by the brain's aversion to negative emotions such as self-blame and disappointment. If you fear the idea of being disappointed in yourself or in someone else being disappointed in you, it's easier to just kind of remain in the denial of whatever it is that you're doing, that whatever it is that you are doing is well considered, even though it may not be any longer. And you don't want to be in the state of getting to that guilt and shame, so you live in the fear and denial portion of it and just kind of sit still. And that can also come with FOBO, which is fear of a better option. You might stand still because you think that, well, another option might present itself that would allow me to get out of this situation or not actually realize that loss in the future. So I'm just going to sit or be in denial about the trend that I'm seeing in front of me, and I'm going to chill out in it. And so we don't want to experience the loss. We head into that guilt and shame space if we go beyond the fear and denial space. And so we let the fear of that happening drive inaction, or we live in denial that the loss is actually necessary and is going to come for us, like it or not. So the third bias that I want to talk about is the status quo bias. This also lives back in the guilt and shame bucket of the four horsemen, and it describes our preference for the current state of affairs, the status quo. And it results in our resistance to change, moving on, accepting the new reality of our financial situation. This one gets a lot of us because I have a lot of personal experience with this, with family, friends, folks that I've coached. It's really easy to just keep doing what you've always been doing and feeling like if my results were decent enough, then they'll continue to be decent enough going forward. And that's not always possible because life's circumstances change. So a lost job is a perfect example of a trigger for status quo bias. If you're used to living in a certain way and being financially stable, being a provider, things like that, when a job loss occurs, maybe you just don't tell your spouse right away. Or maybe you don't get real about adjusting your budget because you start to feel guilty about having to tighten your belt, or you feel ashamed about the need to make a transition to some sort of different financial reality. And so this example could also cross over into the fear and denial bucket also, where you're confident but with no evidence that you'll find something new and you'll have a comparable job soon, you'll have a new salary soon, you'll have something that will kind of fill the gap. So no need to move away from the status quo. And, this can get a lot of folks who are entrepreneurial in nature, who are really go-getters in their own spaces, because you can start thinking, okay, the future is going to look better. I've got this great idea. If this doesn't work out, then the next thing definitely will. And you can sit and rest in that status quo instead of kind of making some of the hard decisions that need to be made and accepting something that's actually occurred and doing something about it, right? So you stick to the status quo. You don't make any necessary financial changes after a loss. And so all of that's one example, a job loss. That's one example of how it could kind of spiral into, okay, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And the reality of that, of course, is that if you keep doing what you're doing and spending how you are typically used to spending, that can be hugely impactful to your finances going forward. So the final bias that I want to talk about is called sunk cost bias. And that I've put in the fear and denial bucket. So we've gone back and forth. Guilt and shame, fear and denial. This is back in the fear and denial bucket. Sunk cost bias is a cognitive bias that causes people to continue investing in something even when it's not in their best interest. So it's a financial loser. You see that it's a financial loser, but you're not quite able to kind of move away from pouring more dollars into it. And failure to move on and end up wasting your time, resources, money, investments in what you've already put in so far. That sunk cost, if you are into business stuff, then they teach you got to let go of the sunk costs. That is baked into the cake. Anything else beyond that is kind of a new dynamic, a new path forward. And so you definitely do not want to be so focused on what you've already invested that it keeps you sitting in that loss and that failure instead of accepting what you've spent and looking very practically at, okay, how am I moving forward? Is what I'm continuing to invest appropriate at this point? Or should I just accept the loss and move on? So you don't want to let that drive your decision to stand still and or to keep investing, to keep losing, or worse, just keep pouring your heart and soul into something that is a losing financial prospect. Okay, so that was a lot of heavy stuff. Loss aversion, regret aversion, status quo bias, sunk cost bias. And they're all kind of, you can see how they're all very circular. They all lead to one another. You're probably feeling some of the fear, denial, guilt, shame. It's all kind of wrapped up in one big bucket when you are tied to a financial loss. And so I want to talk about some ways that working through those losses and kind of just learning to accept what's actually happening can be good for us in the long term. And, how we can mentally and emotionally shore ourselves up for inevitable losses by recognizing actually what we gain from them. And so it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. A lot of the coaching that I would do around financial loss is not just about the practical side of things, of how to utilize those losses, leverage those losses into a win in the short term, but to also think about them in a more behavioral way, emotional way, so that you can leverage them for greater success in the future. And so here are some things that I would say a financial loss can actually give us in the long run. So the first thing is it grows us in wisdom and maturity. So we can look at the mistakes that we've made and we can learn from them. A lot of times, it's a fool me once type of situation. If you have invested in something that was less than prudent, if you went into business with someone without kind of kicking the tires on how their values align with your values, if you have spent money that you actually didn't have before you had it, those are all ways to make a mistake that you can learn from for the future. So financial losses help grow us in wisdom and maturity and in making the best financial decisions for ourselves going forward. They also provide clarity. So why is the loss important to you? Why is the loss bringing up some of those feelings of guilt, shame? Why do you need to deny them? Sometimes the things that we are so scared to let go of, there's a reason for that. You can kind of delve deeper into why something was or feels so difficult for you, and you can find new meaning from that. And so figuring out why that loss is important or why not letting go of that idea is so important to you can really help. So think about what the opportunity cost is. Think about who you're letting down. why it's such a big deal that somebody would be disappointed in you or that you would feel shame. What is that telling you? And it can help provide clarity as far as how you move forward in the future. So you can take the loss as a way to help you understand yourself and your priorities a little bit better. The third thing is losses, financial losses deepen resolve and they create room for what makes sense. So once you have more clarity, you can learn to invest and persevere for the right goals rather than sticking to it or sticking in when something is draining you or your joy. And that can build your tolerance for saying no before you lose. It can build your tolerance for learning what you are going to kind of persevere to keep or to have or to build. And so when you have the clarity, have some more clarity about why that loss is so distressing to you, then it can deepen your resolve to do the things that make sense in your financial life. So because you're tuned in on whether things are really going the way that you want them to, you can shift yourself to make them go a little bit more in the way that you want them to. So the fourth thing is, I think financial losses strengthen our adaptability and our problem-solving skills. So you can mitigate some of the damage from the worst financial mistakes if you don't panic. And instead, you seek some options and alternatives. So, if you're losing money on stock A and it's definitely not working out and you see that and, you've held it for long enough to kind of understand the cycle. Maybe you bought in at the wrong time. Same thing with a home or with a car. If you have poured into something and you know that it's a financial loser, what are some ways that you could maybe mitigate some of that damage? So if you could afford, for instance, if you were underwater on your home, if you could afford to keep it for a little bit longer and maybe rent it out so that you can help mitigate some of the loss versus selling immediately and recognizing some of that loss immediately. If you have purchased a car and it's immediately depreciating well beyond what its useful nature is, maybe you could figure out some way to earn second income off of that vehicle. It's not that you're going to be a financial winner necessarily, but you could potentially be less of a loser in that financial space if you kind of take it as a challenge, a problem to solve, versus stewing in the loss, or worse, sitting in the loss and continuing to realize more and more of it. So you don't want to let loss avoidance keep you stagnant, but you also don't want to make hasty decisions either. So it's almost never a good idea to make big money moves, whether you're hoping to make money or to cut your losses before or after big life events or big things are happening to you. It just leaves you with an unclear mind. And so you want some time to consider all of your options, look at all of your options, ask around, think outside of the box. I know it sounds very cliche, but if you take the time to kind of go through the options and choose the best one where you might be able to lose the least amount of money, that can set you up for future problem solving in similar spaces. And so the last way that I think financial losses can actually be good for us if we embrace them with a growth mindset is that they build your compassion. So having setbacks in life can really help us be more human. And similar to the waiting tables discussion, the idea that if you've waited tables before, you have just a natural compassion for people who are in the service industry, who do kind of a similar thing. Going through financial struggles in life helps us understand how to better listen, provide grace, be generous, be emotionally, financially, or otherwise gracious to our fellow humans, and especially the people who we love and we care about. And it helps us kind of relate to people going through the same or similar things themselves. And so there's always an upswing where you can be grateful and maybe help others cope with debt or financial struggles by helping them feel less alone. And so I think just the opportunity to build and grow your compassion through financial losses is another great thing that you can gain from them. So I'm going to run through those one more time because I want to leave on an optimistic note. Working through financial loss can be very difficult, but I do think it helps us grow in our wisdom and maturity. It helps us learn from our mistakes. It provides clarity because we can think about why the loss is so important to us. It can deepen our resolve and create the room for what does make sense. So once you know why that loss was so devastating to you or would be so devastating to you, you know what you want to work toward and prioritize in the future. And financial losses also strengthen our adaptability and our problem-solving skills. So it really helps us work through problems, financial problems, and maybe with our partner. Maybe it helps us communicate better with our partner about what's going on. And then finally, it builds our compassion. It helps us understand that we're all kind of in the same boat. It really doesn't matter how much money you have. These feelings are feelings that everyone has. These emotions are inherent to us as human beings and especially as parents, as family members, as colleagues, as friends. We have a great sense of responsibility and often obligation to the people around us. And so feeling guilty or ashamed or feeling like you're fearful of making moves or in denial about needing to make them are all very common across all of our financial lives. And so being a little more compassionate, understanding that what somebody else is going through, being empathetic to them can never go wrong. It just helps us be more a part of our communities and our families and be more responsible with our personal finance overall. So I hope this episode was helpful to you all in kind of working through how to potentially turn financial loss into real gains and how to accept financial loss for what it is and embrace it with a growth mindset so that you can move forward. Thanks so much, and I'll be back next week with another episode.